Hey guys, Danny West here for another episode of the Soapbox, or should I say this week, the Notebox. Basically thought I'd switch it up for you this week, and instead of talking about things that you should be doing, maybe starting to speak to things that you definitely should not be doing. And what kind of inspired this was basically last week was a really rough week. Not just for me, but because of the conversations I had to have for dancer patients. That one in particular who unfortunately was diagnosed with a pars fracture and is now out for the rest of the season. But I also had two other girls within the past week, not necessarily fully diagnosed pars fracture, but definitely en route to one based on the pain and how they were extending their spine. And then I also had a dancer full on separate her AC joint, and she's out for part of competition as well. And it's just, these aren't my favorite conversations, and they're so hard to have, and they're awful that, you know, sometimes these things happen, but also it started inspiring me of like, well, maybe I really need to start talking about what not to do. Because that's also just as important as what to do. So I'm going to give you 3 things this week that are definite no's in my book. So for one, really start to educate your kids, your students, on not doing repeated 1,000 repetitions of back extension, okay? The kids I worry about the most, that I find are the most predisposed to injury when doing extension movements of the spine, is the really flexy kids. And this is where, and again, a lot of these kids that ended up with or en route to pars fracture of the spine is because they were super bendy. And not only that, they were super bendy in one particular segment of the spine. So these kids and the parents will kind of be like, oh no, like she's flexible, like she's obviously made for this, she's good at this. And it's like, no, like actually those are the kids we need to reel in and say, you know what, you don't push to your end range. We are watching for any hinging, and that's just in any body. But the number one thing, because these flexy kids are so good at it, just naturally, they can flop into things and they can cheat it. Like, it's not true strength kind of holding them there. They'll do it a million times. They'll do it for their friends at home. They'll do it like on the trampoline. They'll self-teach themselves walkovers. They'll be doing contortionist moves just all the time because it feels fine and it's like so easy in my body. Those are the kids we absolutely need to rein in, and we have to get the education out there that just because you can physically do it, you know, technique aside, doesn't mean you should. And you cannot go off of pain for when you're en route for a pars fracture. Because a lot of the time, like this one girl, she didn't really have back pain until like 3 days before it got really bad. So when you're having pain, it's almost past the point of no return. So that's why we cannot use pain as a guide all the time. Think of this my pipe cleaner analogy. Okay, so this like pipe cleaner would be really good at ACRO, like super bendy, it's like made for this. But if I do this for about the next hour at the same spot over and over and over, you know, pipe cleaner doesn't have any pain, feels pretty good, looks like it's what it was made to do. If I keep doing this at this one section of the spine 1,000 times, what's gonna happen? This area gets super weak, super unstable, and that's when it's bad news bears. But not because of the first time, it's the repeated ones, okay? So number one thing on the note box this week is just because you can do it, please don't do it 1,001 times on your own time. And you need to be darn sure that if you are a flexy kid, you are doing it properly and you have proper core strength. And you know what? I haven't seen one kid yet where I'm like, she's been working on her core strength, because core is not abs, folks. And go to episode 2 of the Soapbox for more info on that. Okay, so that's the first thing. If you're super flexy, please don't do these repeated extensions 1,000 times. Just because you don't have pain doesn't mean there's not damage currently happening. Okay, number 2. Let's talk about my patient who had an AC joint dislocation this past week. She was doing ACRO. She was balancing on a friend's hands and she felt her shoulder go clunk. 2 nopes for this. Again, as maybe a way to prevent it. Now, I'm not saying this was like for sure, she was for sure at risk by doing this, but I'm just gonna say from a physio standpoint, even if I had like a non-dancer, non-gymnast in, if they were doing these things at home, I would can them. So the first thing that I'll hear kids explaining is one of the stretches that they do in an ACRO class is they'll stick their arms through a chair and just like hang there. So through a chair, and I just kind of like stretch out my shoulders like this. So physio world, this is a huge no-no. This already puts the shoulder into an anterior dislocation position. This shoulder is already really unstable if the humerus is forward in the socket. And here we are stretching. And I get the point is to try to stretch the pecs and loosen up the front of the shoulder. So while the intentions might have been good for whoever was instructing this or came up with that stretch, I get where you were going with that, but this is a huge no-no for pressure on the anterior joint capsule of the shoulder, just in the regular person. So not the best way to stretch out the pec. There is other ways to stretch it out. So please don't hang out there. These shoulders are already probably sitting forward in the joint from just sitting protracted, and then we're gonna go put it more in the anterior portion of the joint by stretching it this way. The shoulder's anterior capsule does not need to be stretched. In fact, if it stretches too much, again, it predisposes us to dislocating anteriorly, which 9 times out of 10, it's usually the way the shoulder dislocates anyway. So you're actually stretching the capsule with that, which is what we don't want, not the pecs. So please, no chair stretching of the arm, ever. Second thing relating to the shoulder, that's a big nope, is training your planks like this. Puffing up the mid part of the spine. And I don't know where this came from, but when I ask a kid who maybe has been doing some conditioning, again, I'm not pointing the finger at any particular studio or training regime, but these are some of the things I just keep hearing kids doing, and I'm like, okay, let's stop already. So their neutral plank is with this puffed up spine, and it's like, no. Like, that is not neutral spine. Plank should be held referencing a neutral spine. And so the kids think neutral is this puffed out upper back. Yes, the upper back has a bit of what we call a kyphotic curve, okay? So it kind of goes this way naturally. We don't want to overdo it and really accentuate the kyphosis of the spine, okay? So that's not anatomically neutral. And every time we do that, we're training the brain and the proprioception of the spine to be like, oh, okay, this is neutral. This is where I need to be whenever I'm like prone or like face down or in a handstand, they might be doing that. So just think about this. So if I'm here and I puff out my spine, if I kept that positioning and I stood up, so if you had a kid in class doing this, holding the arms out in front of you, does that look correct to you? No, you would immediately correct that in standing. So why should it be any different when we're trying to reference neutral spine in a plank position? It shouldn't be. So neutral, yes, we want to honor a tiny bit of the curve back, but do you see how this, and shoulders still retracted, is very different than this, okay? And what does that do to my shoulder joint, my AC joint, when I puff the ribs out? I'm protracted. Shoulders sitting forward in the joint. That's our anterior dislocation position, okay? So I can see if it's going through a movement. That's a strengthener of the shoulder. So if I'm in plank and I'm going retraction, protraction, and I'm moving through it, and my intention is to strengthen the shoulder, that's different. But if I ask a kid, let's see your plank, they immediately go puffed. Nuh-uh, we gotta retrain that, because now that's what their body's gonna be referencing every time they have their hands out in front of them. And what does that predispose them to? AC joint separation or anterior shoulder dislocation. All right, so it's just not an ideal spot to have the shoulder, and the shoulder isn't that strong when it's sitting in a protracted position. So if you're ever not sure, if you're like, something looks funny about this positioning, I don't think this looks neutral, take that position, try it in standing, and see if you could suss it out. Because if it looks wrong here, it's definitely not ideal when you flip that position prone in a different relationship to gravity. So, recap. No repeated extensions of the spine, okay? Just because you're bendy, do not do it as a party trick all the time, okay? Second 2 points are for the shoulder. So again, no arm stretchy through the chair. It's putting too much pressure on the anterior joint capsule, and you're already predisposed to anterior dislocation of the shoulder, okay? We don't want to stretch it in that position. So other ways to stretch the pecs. And then the third point, again relating to the shoulder, is do not train your planks in that puffed position. You can move through it, like you're doing, I call them shoulder blade push-ups, that's okay. But I should be able to ask you to go into a plank and you can show me a neutral spine, and those shoulders should be retracted. That's what they're designed for, that's where they're the strongest, is here, not rounded forward. Okay, again, anterior dislocation risk with that. So those are probably my top 3 nopes for the note box this week. And again, just inspired by the unfortunate incidents of some patients this week. And so I thought, well, instead of maybe talking about what to do, I think I might start shedding some light on also what not to do or try to stay away from. I know the intentions are good with some of these things, but they've just kind of missed the mark a little bit in terms of anatomical positioning. And again, we have to always reference neutral and try to strengthen in and around neutral so we can stabilize on a stable base and move our limbs properly. So that's the note box for today, and we will see you next week. Thanks, guys.